It was another cold Tuesday night in the city. David pulled his jacket tighter as he walked down the empty street. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. He had just finished his shift at the community center, where he worked helping kids stay off the streets. It was past 11, and most people were already home, safe and warm. David loved his job even though it didn't pay much. Every day he saw young people who needed someone to believe in them. Today had been especially good. A teenager named Tony had finally agreed to go back to school after dropping out 6 months ago. These small victories made all the late nights worth it. The community center was in a tough part of town. But David had never felt afraid. He knew many of the families in the neighborhood. He had grown up not far from here himself. People respected him because he genuinely cared about making their lives better. He never judged anyone, no matter what mistakes they had made. As he turned into a narrow alley that was a shortcut to his apartment, David heard footsteps behind him. He glanced back and saw 3 young men following him. Something in their movements made his heart beat faster. They were walking too close together, looking around nervously. David picked up his pace, hoping to reach the main street quickly. "Hey, wait up!" one of them called out. David stopped and turned around. The 3 young men had caught up to him. They looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. Their clothes were worn and dirty. Their eyes had a strange, distant look that David recognized from his work at the center. They were under the influence of something. "We need some money, man," the tallest one said. His voice was shaky, desperate. "Just whatever you got." David's mind raced. He had been in situations like this before, but usually during the day at the center when help was nearby. Now he was alone in a dark alley with 3 desperate young men. He could see they were scared too, which somehow made the situation more dangerous. "Look, I understand you're in a tough spot," David said calmly. "I only have about $20 on me. Can have it, but maybe we can talk about what's really going on here." The second young man, shorter with nervous eyes, laughed bitterly. $20? That's nothing, man. We need real money. David slowly reached for his wallet, keeping his movements clear and non-threatening. "This is all I have. I'm not trying to trick you. I work at the community center a few blocks from here. Maybe I can help you find other ways to get what you need." The third young man, who looked the youngest of the group, was standing slightly behind the others. David could see he was shaking, not from cold, but from fear. His hands were clenched into fists, and he kept looking around as if expecting someone to jump out at them. "You don't understand," the tall one said, his voice getting more agitated. "We need money now. Tonight, our situation is really bad." David handed over his wallet. "Take it all, but please, let me help you properly. Whatever trouble you're in, there might be another way." The young men looked at each other uncertainly. For a moment, David thought they might actually listen to him. He had talked many young people out of making terrible decisions. He knew how to connect with them, how to show them they had choices. But then the youngest one suddenly pulled something from his jacket. In the dim light, David saw the flash of metal. It was a knife, and the young man was holding it with trembling. "Hands! This is taking too long," the youngest one said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We can't mess around." "Put that away," David said gently, raising his hands. "You don't need that. I'm not fighting you. Take the money and go. No one has to get hurt here." But the youngest man was beyond reason. David could see the desperation in his eyes. It's mixed with something else. Shame. This young man didn't want to be here doing this. Something had pushed him to this point, and now he was too scared to back down. "I'm sorry," the young man whispered. And David realized what was about to happen. The knife moved forward before David could react. He felt a sharp pain in his stomach and stumbled backward against the brick wall. The 3 young men panicked and ran, leaving David alone in the alley. As David slid down the wall to sit on the cold ground, he pressed his hand against his stomach. He could feel warmth spreading through his shirt. He managed to pull out his phone and call for help, his voice surprisingly steady as he gave his location. While waiting for the ambulance, something strange happened. Instead of anger or hatred, David found himself thinking about the fear he had seen in the young men's eyes, especially the one who had hurt him. That young man had said he was sorry. He had looked like he was in as much pain as David was now. Feeling, David closed his eyes and thought about all the young people he had worked with over the years. Many of them had been in desperate situations. Many had made terrible choices when they felt they had no other options. This young man with the knife was probably no different. As the sirens grew louder, David made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. Instead of planning for revenge, he found himself hoping that somehow this young man would get the help he clearly needed.
Ow.
In his moment of greatest pain and fear, David chose to see the humanity in the person who had hurt him. The ambulance arrived, and as the paramedics worked on him, David's last conscious thought before the pain medication took effect was a prayer. Not for justice or punishment, but for mercy. For himself, yes, but also for the scared young man who had just changed both their lives forever. This choice, made in a moment of terror and pain, would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything David thought he knew about forgiveness. Justice and the true nature of the people's society often writes off as beyond help. 3 days later, David woke up in a hospital bed with tubes connected to his arm and a dull ache in his stomach. The surgery had gone well, the doctor said, but he would need weeks to recover completely. His sister Carmen was sitting beside his bed, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "Thank God you're awake," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We were so scared we might lose you." David tried to sit up but winced at the pain. The memories of that night came flooding back. The dark alley, the 3 young men, the fear in their eyes, and the moment everything changed. He remembered the youngest one saying he was sorry just before everything went dark. Later that morning, Detective Rodriguez came to visit. She was a kind woman in her 40s who had been working in this neighborhood for over 10 years. She pulled up a chair next to David's bed and opened her notepad.
Ow.
"I'm glad to see you're doing better," she said with a gentle smile. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened that night." David nodded. "Slowly, I understand. I want to help however I can." The detective asked him to describe everything he remembered. David told her about the 3 young men, their desperate behavior, and how scared they all seemed. He described the youngest one in detail, remembering how his hands had been shaking and how he had apologized before running away. "We've been looking at security cameras from nearby buildings," Detective Rodriguez explained. "We found some footage that shows the incident. We've identified one of the attackers. His name is Tyler, and he's 19 years old. We arrested him yesterday at his grandmother's house." David felt a strange mix of emotions hearing this news. Part of him was relieved that they had found the person responsible, but another part of him felt sad thinking about that scared young man now sitting in a jail cell. "What will happen to him?" David asked. "Well, that partly depends on you," the detective replied. "The prosecutor wants to charge him with attempted murder. With his previous record, he could be looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. But your testimony will be important in determining the final charges." David was quiet for a long moment. Carmen looked at him with concern. She had been hoping to hear that the person who hurt her brother would face serious consequences. "Detective, can you tell me more about this young man, about his background?" David asked. Detective Rodriguez looked surprised. "That's unusual, but I suppose I can share some basic information. Tyler has been in trouble before, mostly for theft and minor fights. He lives with his grandmother because his mother passed away a few years ago." "Why do you ask?" "I keep thinking about how scared he looked that night," David said slowly. "Something was driving him to desperation. I'd like to understand what that was before I decide how to proceed." Carmen stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "David, what are you talking about? This person nearly killed you. He stabbed you and left you bleeding in an alley. Why do you care about his background?" "'Cause understanding why something happened is the first step to preventing it from happening again," David replied. "I've worked with troubled young people for years. I know that good people sometimes make terrible choices when they feel they have no other options." The detective closed her notepad and looked at David carefully. "Mr. David, I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've seen many victims. Most of them want justice, which usually means the maximum punishment for whoever hurt them. Are you saying you don't want that?" I'm saying I want to understand what justice really means. In this case, David answered, can I speak with Tyler's lawyer? I'd like to learn more about his situation before the prosecutor decides on the charges. Carmen shook her head in disbelief. David, you're being too kind. This person could have killed you. What if he does this to someone else? It's exactly. Why I need to understand what drove him to this point, David said firmly but gently. If we just lock him away without addressing the root causes, we haven't really solved anything. We've just postponed the problem. Over the next few days, several people came to visit David in the hospital. His coworkers from the community center brought flowers and cards from the kids he worked with. His mother, a deeply religious woman, spent hours praying beside his bed. She was the only one who seemed to understand his desire to learn more about Tyler before seeking punishment. Mijo, she said one evening, using the Spanish nickname she had called him since childhood, your heart is in the right place. Sometimes showing mercy takes more courage than seeking revenge. The prosecutor, Mrs. Williams, came to visit David a week after the incident. She was a tough woman who had built her reputation on getting maximum sentences for violent crimes. She explained that Tyler's case could set an important example for other young people considering similar actions. Mr. David, I understand you've been asking questions about the defendant, she said. I want you to know that Tyler has a history of bad choices. This wasn't his first time breaking the law. If we don't send a strong message now, he'll likely hurt someone else in the future. David listened carefully but remained unconvinced. Mrs. Williams, what if there's another way to send a message? What if we can show that our justice system is about rehabilitation and prevention, not just punishment? That's a noble idea, the prosecutor replied. But this young man stabbed. You in an alley? The law is clear about the consequences for such actions. That night, David lay awake, thinking about everything he had heard. He thought about Tyler sitting in a jail cell, probably scared and alone. He thought about the other two young men who were still out there, possibly planning their next desperate act. He thought about all the young people he had worked with who had been given second chances and had turned their lives around. By morning, David had made his decision. He called Detective Rodriguez and asked if he could meet with Tyler's public defender. He wanted to hear Tyler's full story before the legal system decided his fate. This choice surprised everyone who knew David, but it felt right to him. He remembered the fear in Tyler's eyes that night, and he believed that fear came from somewhere deeper than just getting caught. Something had pushed that young man to the breaking point, and David was determined to understand what it was. Only then could he decide what real justice should look like in this case. 2 weeks after the incident, David was finally strong enough to leave the hospital. He went straight to the public defender's office to meet with Tyler's lawyer, Mr. Johnson. The office was small and cramped, with stacks of case files covering every surface. Mr. Johnson looked tired, like someone carrying the weight of too many hopeless cases. I have to be honest with you, Mr. Johnson said as they sat down. In 20 years of doing this job, I've never had a victim ask to learn about their attacker's background. Most people just want to see them punished as harshly as possible. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still feeling pain from his healing wound. I need to understand what happened that night. It's not just the attack itself, but what led up to it. What drove that young man to such desperation? Mr. Johnson opened Tyler's file and spread several documents across his desk. Tyler's story isn't unique, unfortunately. It's one I see too often in this neighborhood, but maybe hearing it will help you understand. He began with Tyler's childhood. Tyler had grown up in a small apartment with his mother and grandmother. His father had never been in the picture. His mother, Lisa, had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but she struggled with addiction. When Tyler was 15, she overdosed and died, leaving him alone with his grandmother. His grandmother, Mrs. Chen, is 78 years old. Mr. Johnson explained, she has diabetes and dementia. Tyler dropped out of school when he was 16 to take care of her and work whatever jobs he could find. David listened carefully, picturing this young man suddenly becoming responsible for an elderly woman while still being a child himself. What kind of work was he doing? It's mostly minimum wage jobs. Fast food, grocery stores, cleaning offices at night. Sometimes he worked 2 jobs at once, but it was never enough. Mrs. Chen's medical bills were enormous. Her diabetes medication alone costs over $300 a month, and that's with insurance. The lawyer showed David some of the medical bills and pharmacy receipts. The numbers were staggering. David realized that Tyler had been trying to survive on maybe $800 or $900 a month while facing medical bills that exceeded that amount. The week before the incident, Mr. Johnson continued. Mrs. Chen had been without her medication for 4 days, away from 3 different pharmacies because he couldn't pay. He was watching his grandmother get sicker every day, and he felt completely helpless. David felt a heaviness in his chest as he imagined Tyler's desperation. He thought about his own grandmother, who had raised him after his parents divorced. The idea of watching her suffer while being unable to help would have driven him to desperate measures too. "What about the other 2 men who were with him that night?" David asked. "Those were not Tyler's friends," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "He met them that same evening at a bus stop. He was crying, and they approached him. When they learned about his situation, they convinced him that one quick job would solve all his problems. They gave him some pills to calm his nerves and told him all he had to do was stand there while they handled everything." David's understanding of that night began to shift. Tyler hadn't been a hardened criminal looking for easy money. He had been a scared young man at the end of his rope, manipulated by others who saw his desperation as an opportunity. "He'd never used drugs before that night?" David asked. "Never. The police tests confirmed that. The pills those men gave him were some kind of stimulant mixed with a depressant. Tyler had no idea what he was taking, just knew he was too scared to go through with their plan without something to help him." Mr. Johnson pulled out another document. Tyler had never even held a weapon before that night. The knife belonged to one of the other men. In fact, Tyler told me he tried to back out twice during the evening, but the other men threatened to hurt his grandmother if he didn't follow through. David sat in silence for several minutes, processing this information. The young man he had seen in that alley wasn't the monster he had initially imagined. Tyler was a victim too, in many ways. Circumstances had pushed him into an impossible situation, and desperate people had taken advantage of his fear. "I'd like to meet him," David said finally. Mr. Johnson looked surprised. "Meet Tyler? Are you sure about that?" "Prosecutor won't like it. She's building a case that portrays him as a dangerous repeat offender." "He's not a repeat offender of violent crimes, is he?" David asked. "Oh, his previous arrests were for stealing food, and once for sleeping in a parking garage during winter. Survival crimes, basically. Nothing violent until that night." David made up his mind. "I want to visit him. Can you arrange that?" 3 days later, David sat in a small visiting room at the county jail. When Tyler was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, David was struck by how young and small he looked. Tyler's eyes were red and swollen, like he had been crying. When he saw David, he immediately looked down at the floor. "I'm so sorry," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you so bad. I never wanted to hurt anyone." David studied Tyler's face. He saw a genuine remorse, not the cold indifference of someone who didn't care about others. "Tell me about your grandmother," David said gently. Tyler looked up, surprised by the question. For the next hour, he told David about Mrs. Chen, how she had taught him to cook traditional Chinese dishes, how she stayed up with him when he was sick as a child, how she still called him by the nickname she had given him when he was 5 years old, even though her memory was failing. "She doesn't even understand why I'm not home," Tyler said, tears streaming down his face. "The social worker says she asks for me every day. She's probably scared and confused, wondering where I went." David realized that Tyler's punishment wasn't just the jail time he might face. Every day he spent locked up was another day his grandmother suffered without the person who had been caring for her. The system was punishing not just Tyler, but an innocent elderly woman who had already lost so much. As David left the jail that day, he knew what he had to do. Tyler wasn't the monster everyone wanted him to be. He was a young man who had made a terrible mistake under impossible circumstances. David had seen enough in his work to know that people could change, that redemption was possible, especially for someone who genuinely wanted to make things right. The question now was whether the legal system would allow room for mercy. It would simply add Tyler to the long list of young lives destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. After meeting Tyler, David couldn't sleep for 3 nights. He kept thinking about the young man's tears and his grandmother sitting alone, confused and scared. David knew he had to make a decision that would shock everyone, including himself. The next morning, David called Mr. Johnson and told him about his plan. "I want to speak at Tyler's sentencing hearing. I want to ask the judge for mercy." There was silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Mr. Johnson spoke. "David, are you absolutely sure about this? Once you do this, there's no going back. The media will probably pick up the story. People might not understand, I'm sure," David replied. "This young man made a terrible mistake, but destroying his life won't undo what happened to me. Maybe we can find a way to help him become someone who prevents others from making the same choice." Word of David's decision spread quickly. Within days, reporters were calling him, wanting to know why a victim would defend his attacker. Some people called him a saint. Others said he was being foolish and naive. The comment sections of online news articles were filled with angry messages. From people who thought Tyler deserved the harshest punishment possible, Carmen came to David's apartment one evening, clearly upset. "The whole neighborhood is talking about this. People think you've lost your mind," Mrs. Patterson from down the street said. "You're encouraging criminals to hurt innocent people." David sighed and made tea for both of them. "Carmen, I know this. It's hard to understand. I keep thinking about all the young people I've worked with over the years. Many of them were one bad decision away from ending up like Tyler. What if someone had shown them mercy when they needed it most?" "But what if Tyler hurts someone else?" Carmen asked. "What if your mercy gets another person stabbed?" "What if it doesn't?" David replied. "What if giving him a chance to make things right prevents him from ever hurting anyone again? What if it shows other young people that there's always another choice?" The day of the sentencing hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and Tyler's few remaining family members. Tyler sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than ever in his oversized suit. His grandmother was there too, in a wheelchair. Looking confused but holding a photo of Tyler as a young boy, Judge Williams. A stern woman known for tough sentences called the court to order. The prosecutor went first, painting Tyler as a repeat offender who would certainly hurt others if not given a long prison sentence. She showed photos of David's wounds and described the terror he must have felt that night. Then Mr. Johnson presented Tyler's defense, explaining his desperate circumstances and his role as his grandmother's caregiver. Called several character witnesses, including Tyler's former teacher and his elderly neighbor, who testified about Tyler's kindness and dedication to his grandmother. Finally, it was David's turn to speak. The courtroom fell completely silent as he walked slowly to the podium, still moving carefully due to his healing injuries. Every eye was on him as he began to speak. "Your Honor, 3 months ago I was stabbed by the young man sitting at that table. I almost died that night. I spent weeks in the hospital and I still feel pain every day. Nothing Tyler did was right, and I'm not here to excuse his actions." David paused and looked directly at Tyler, who was crying silently. "But I'm also here as someone who has worked with troubled young people for over 10 years. I've seen kids who seemed hopeless turn their lives around when someone believed in them. I've seen the difference between justice and revenge." He turned back to the judge. Tyler made a terrible choice that night, but it was a choice born from desperation, not evil. He was manipulated by others who took advantage of his fear for his grandmother. If we lock him away for 20 years, we accomplish nothing except destroying 2 lives, his and his grandmother's. David's voice grew stronger. As he continued, "I'm asking this court to consider an alternative. Give Tyler a chance to prove that people can change. Let him serve his time through community service, helping other young people avoid the mistakes he made. Make him get counseling and education. But don't throw away a life that could still do good in this world." The prosecutor objected, saying this was highly irregular. But Judge Williams allowed David to continue. "Tyler told me something when I visited him in jail. He said he thinks about that night every single day. He said he would give anything to take it back. Your Honor, I believe him. I believe he's genuinely sorry. And I believe that mercy can sometimes accomplish what punishment cannot." David returned to his seat, and the courtroom remained silent for several moments. Tyler was openly sobbing now, and even some of the reporters looked moved by David's words. Judge Williams took a recess to consider her decision. When court resumed, she looked directly at Tyler before speaking. "Mr. Tyler, what happened that night was serious and cannot be ignored. However, I have been deeply moved by Mr. David's testimony and his request for mercy. I sentence you to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 3 years, provided you complete your education, participate in counseling, and commit to community service upon release." The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some people applauded David's victory, while others shouted that justice had not been served. Tyler collapsed in relief, while his grandmother reached out her shaking hands toward him. After the hearing, David was surrounded by reporters. "Why did you do this?" one of them asked. "Aren't you afraid he'll hurt someone else?" David thought carefully before answering. "I did this because I believe in second chances, because I believe that showing mercy is sometimes the strongest thing you can do, and because I hope that Tyler will spend the rest of his life proving that this mercy was not misplaced." That night, David received dozens of phone calls and messages. Some praised his courage, while others criticized his decision. But David felt at peace for the first time since the attack. He had chosen hope over fear, mercy over revenge, and he believed that choice would make all the difference in Tyler's future. 3 weeks later, David received a letter from Tyler in prison. It was simple and short. "Thank you for seeing the person I want to be, not just the person I was that night. I promise I will spend every day trying to deserve your mercy." David folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. The real test was just beginning. 3 years passed like pages turning in a book. David had almost forgotten the constant ache in his stomach from that night, though he still carried a small scar as a reminder. He was at the community center one Tuesday afternoon when Mr. Johnson called with news that would change everything again. "Tyler's being released next week," the lawyer said. His parole was approved. He completed his education program, finished counseling, and the prison staff wrote glowing reports about his behavior. "David, I think you should know that Tyler asks about you in every letter he sends me." David felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. For 3 years, he and Tyler had exchanged letters once a month. Tyler had earned his high school diploma and started taking college courses through a prison program. He had also been helping other young inmates avoid the mistakes that had landed them in jail. "Has he found a place to stay?" David asked. "What about work?" "That's the problem," Mr. Johnson replied. "Most employers won't hire someone with his record. Finding housing is nearly impossible. I'm worried he might end up back on the streets." David made a decision that surprised even himself. "Tell him I have a job waiting for him." The next week, David stood outside the prison gates as Tyler walked out carrying a small bag of belongings. Tyler looked different now. He was taller, more confident, but his eyes still held the same kindness. David remembered. When Tyler saw David, he stopped walking and just stared. "I can't believe you came," Tyler said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I told you I'd be here," David replied. "Are you ready to start over?" David had arranged for Tyler to work at the community center, starting in maintenance, while he continued his education. It wasn't easy convincing the board of directors. Some of them worried about having someone with a criminal record around the children and teenagers they served. "This is exactly the kind of person who can make a real difference," David had argued. At the board meeting, who better to talk to at-risk kids than someone who has been exactly where they are? Tyler's first day at the center was awkward. Some staff members avoided him, and a few parents questioned whether their children were safe. Tyler kept his head down and worked quietly, cleaning floors and maintaining the building. He never complained, even when people whispered about him, as he walked by, but gradually things began to change. Tyler had a natural way with the teenagers who came to the center. Many of them were dealing with the same struggles he had faced: poverty, family problems, and the temptation to make quick money through illegal means. One evening, David was staying late to finish paperwork when he heard voices from the main room. He looked out and saw Tyler sitting with a group of teenagers talking quietly. David moved closer to listen. "I know what it's like to feel like you have no choices," Tyler was saying to a 16-year-old boy named Alex who had been getting into trouble at school. I thought the only way to help my grandmother was to do something terrible. But there are always other options, even when you can't see them. Alex looks skeptical. Easy for you to say, man. You don't know what my situation is like. Actually, I do, Tyler replied. 3 years ago, I was so desperate to get money for my grandmother's medicine that I made the worst decision of my life. I hurt someone who was only trying to help people. Like us, I almost destroyed my whole future because I couldn't see any other way. The teenagers listened with growing interest as Tyler told his story. He didn't make excuses for what he had done, but he helped them understand how desperation could lead to terrible choices. More importantly, he showed them that it was possible to come back from those choices. The man I hurt could have sent me away forever, Tyler continued. Instead, he chose to believe I could change. That's the only reason I'm sitting here with you right now instead of rotting in a prison cell. Someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. David felt tears in his eyes as he listened. Tyler had become exactly what David had hoped he could be. Someone who could reach young people because he understood their struggles firsthand. Over the next few months, Tyler's impact at the center became undeniable. The number of teenagers participating in programs increased. School attendance improved among the kids Tyler worked with. Most importantly, several young people who had been heading towards serious trouble turned their lives around after talking with Tyler. One day, David received a call that brought back memories of that terrible night 3 years earlier. The police had arrested the other 2 men who had been with Tyler in the alley. Unlike Tyler, they had continued making bad choices and were now facing long prison sentences for a series of robberies. It's interesting, Detective Rodriguez told David over the phone. These 2 men show no remorse at all. They blame everyone else for their problems. It really makes you appreciate how different Tyler turned out. That evening, David shared the news with Tyler as they locked up the center together. Tyler was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Those could have been me," he said softly. "If you hadn't given me a chance to see a different path, I would probably be sitting in a cell next to them right now." The biggest test of Tyler's transformation came when David's own nephew, Roberto, started getting involved with a local gang. Roberto was 15 and angry at the world after his father left the family. He had stopped going to school and was staying out all night. Carmen called David in tears. "Roberto won't listen to anyone. He says we don't understand what he's going through. I'm afraid he's going to end up in jail or worse." David tried talking to Roberto, but the teenager just rolled his eyes and walked away. Carmen tried, their mother tried, even Roberto's teacher tried. Nothing worked. Finally, David asked Tyler to try. "You have street credibility that none of us have," David explained. "Roberto might listen to you." Tyler found Roberto hanging out with older boys behind a convenience store. Instead of lecturing him, Tyler simply shared his own story. He talked about the anger he had felt after his mother died, the frustration of working multiple jobs and still not having enough money, and the moment when he had let other people convince him that crime was his only option. The worst part wasn't going to prison, Tyler told Roberto. "The worst part was knowing that I had become exactly the kind of person who makes our neighborhood unsafe for families like yours." Something in Tyler's words reached Roberto in a way that no adult lecture had. Maybe it was because Tyler had actually lived through similar struggles, or maybe it was because Tyler didn't judge him. Whatever it was, Roberto began spending time at the community center instead of on the streets. 6 months later, Roberto was back in school and talking about becoming a counselor himself someday. Carmen hugged Tyler with tears in her eyes, thanking him for saving her son. As David watched Tyler work with young people day after day, he realized something profound. That terrible night in the alley hadn't just changed Tyler's life. It had created a ripple effect that was still spreading. Every young person Tyler helped was someone who might not end up making the same mistakes. Every family that stayed together, because their teenager chose a different path, was a victory that grew from David's choice to show mercy instead of seeking revenge. One evening, as they cleaned up after a particularly successful youth program, Tyler turned to David with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," Tyler said. "Every single day for the past 3 years, I've thought about that night. Not because I feel guilty anymore, but because I'm grateful. You could have destroyed my life, but instead you saved it. More than that, you've helped me save other lives, too. David smiled and put his hand on Tyler's shoulder. You saved your own life, Tyler. I just gave you the chance to do it. Looking around the community center filled with artwork from the kids they worked with, David finally understood the truth he had been searching for since that night in the alley. People weren't monsters or saints. They were human beings capable of both terrible mistakes and incredible redemption. The difference often came down to whether someone was willing to see their potential for good. Even in their darkest moments, Tyler had proven that mercy wasn't weakness, it was the strongest force for change in the world.